When we think of skyscrapers, we imagine cities that defy the clouds. New York, Dubai, Hong Kong, huge, gleaming towers erected as symbols of power and progress. But in Europe, a continent of rich, urbanized, and highly developed nations, this phenomenon seems to have met with resistance. The European sky remains largely unobstructed. In the 21st century, with technology capable of building vertical cities in months, why do so many European capitals still prefer to grow horizontally? The answer lies not only in concrete, but in the invisible layers of time. Despite its economic strength and population density, Europe seems to have made a choice to preserve its past, even if it means limiting its future. The discrepancy is striking. More than 66% of the continent's skyscrapers are concentrated in just 5 cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Moscow, and Istanbul. And even in these centers, the towers are hidden in remote areas, carefully planned so as not to interfere with the historical aesthetics. In most European cities, Rome, Vienna, Madrid, Prague, buildings remain mostly low-rise, with few floors, preserved facades, and silhouettes that have barely changed in centuries. Meanwhile, in Middle Eastern cities like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, the skyline is constantly being rewritten. The United Arab Emirates, for example, has transformed the desert into a forest of steel and glass. Burj Khalifa, the tallest tower in the world, symbolizes this ambition. In Europe, architectural ambition seems to have turned inward, not upward. But this does not mean that Europe is averse to innovation. Quite the contrary. European cities lead the way in urban planning, quality of life, and sustainability. The decision to avoid skyscrapers is, in many cases, a manifestation of deeply rooted cultural values, an attachment to identity, to collective memory, and to the urban landscape as an untouchable heritage. This refusal to grow vertically was not just a coincidence. It is the result of centuries of urban development that, when confronted with the brutal modernity of American skyscrapers, reacted with resistance. While New York and Chicago were beginning their race to the sky in the late 19th century, European metropolises were already densely built, with narrow streets, ancient squares, and an urban layout shaped by empires and revolutions. There was no space, nor desire, to transform these cities into vertical versions of the New World. But what lies behind this resistance? Why did London give in part, while Rome resisted completely? The answer requires delving deeper, understanding not only geography and economics, but the soul of a continent that chose to look back before aiming upward. Europe is made of layers. Beneath every street, there are centuries of history. In every ancient building, a chapter of humanity. When the first skyscrapers began to appear in America in the late 19th century, cities like Paris, Rome, and Vienna were already practically complete, not in height, but in identity. They were fully formed cities, full of symbols, stories, and consecrated architectural styles. New York and Chicago, on the other hand, were almost blank pages, eager to write their own grandeur with concrete, steel, and glass. This difference in timing was crucial. Modern architecture was born with the mission of breaking with the past, of creating a new language for a new era. But for many European cities, this rupture was a threat, not only to the facades and streets, but to the very soul of the place. The idea of going vertical meant erasing or hiding what was most valuable: the historical heritage, the monuments, the old towns. Europe, unlike the United States, was not trying to reinvent itself. It wanted to remember who it was. In addition, there was a purely practical issue. European cities were built at a time when cars did not exist, elevators were rare, and modern building codes were not even imagined. The streets were narrow, the neighborhoods dense, and the underground infrastructure, such as sewers and foundations, could not support the weight and depth required by large towers. Building upwards was simply unfeasible without major interventions that few had the courage to propose. But there was also a cultural and symbolic dimension. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the United States established itself as the new power, in the global context, a kind of silent architectural rivalry emerged. While Americans displayed their towers as trophies of progress, Europeans reacted with pride by preserving their roots. It was as if, for every skyscraper built in Manhattan, Europe responded by restoring a Baroque square, a Gothic cathedral, a Renaissance palace. This stance was not just an aesthetic preference, but an ideological statement. While the United States sought to impress with the new, Europe sought to thrill with the eternal. A new modern building might be functional, but it did not carry the aura of a 17th century building. And this aura was non-negotiable. Cities like Florence, Prague, or Bruges became almost urban sanctuaries, where any modern intervention was seen as heresy. The landscape had to be respected, and building codes began to protect not only the buildings, but the view of the city itself, the skylines, the contours of church towers, the silence of ancient squares. But this choice came at a price. While other parts of the world were exploding vertically to accommodate growing populations, Europe was struggling with space shortages and rising real estate prices. Protecting the past was beginning to clash with the demands of the present. World War II left a trail of ruins across Europe. Historic cities were bombed, entire neighborhoods turned to dust, and the continent found itself at an urban crossroads. Rebuild what had been destroyed, or take advantage of the tragedy to radically modernize? The choice seemed logical. Here was the perfect opportunity to start over from scratch, with wider streets, taller buildings, more efficient structures. And indeed, this was the path many imagined Europe would take. But the response was, for the most part, the opposite. Instead of skyscrapers, Europe chose to restore. Instead of creating cities of the future, it preferred to rescue cities of the past. In places like Warsaw, which was almost completely razed to the ground, every stone was replaced, every facade reproduced from old paintings and records. In Dresden, the Baroque city center rose from the ashes decades after the war, rebuilt with almost religious precision. The message was clear. Modernity could wait. Identity could not. This rebuilding movement had deep emotional roots. The destruction of the war had not only been physical, but symbolic. By restoring churches, squares, and old buildings, Europeans were, in effect, rebuilding their own souls. Skyscrapers, in this context, seemed like intruders, towers of a world that did not understand the value of memory. In Western Europe, this mentality was even more striking. Countries like France, Italy, Germany, and Belgium, even in the face of devastation, avoided the temptation of verticalization. They invested in social housing, yes, but preferred low-rise buildings, with local features, integrated into the urban fabric. The intention was not to compete with New York or Chicago, but to overcome time through the preservation of memory. In Eastern Europe, on the other hand, skyscrapers appeared, but not as a celebration of progress, but as instruments of power. These were monumental, standardized, oppressive towers, like the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw or the Seven Sisters in Moscow. In these cases, height was not an invitation to modernity, but an ideological imposition. These were structures made to be seen, not admired. The difference in intention between East and West became clear in the following decades. While the Soviets were erecting gray, repetitive concrete skyscrapers, the West was restoring colored glass windows, Renaissance columns, and slate roofs. It was not just an aesthetic choice, but a way of resisting, of saying that, despite the war, Europe was still Europe. However, not all places followed this path with the same intensity. There were internal tensions, economic pressures, and real estate speculation. At times, verticalization seemed inevitable, and when it arrived, it often brought rejection, revolt, and an urban resistance movement that would change city planning forever. In the 1960s, while Europe was breathing the winds of reconstruction, Brussels decided to take a different path. The Belgian capital, seat of European institutions, and symbol of continental integration, was plunged into a radical transformation. The past would be erased to make way for the future. It was the beginning of a process that would become known, almost pejoratively, as Brusselisation. The term was born out of pain. In the name of progress, entire neighborhoods were demolished. Historic buildings, century-old cafes, and narrow, charming streets disappeared overnight. In their place were blocks of glass and concrete, generic towers, without personality, that could have been anywhere in the world. Brussels stopped being Brussels and became a warning. There was no consistent urban planning. Decisions were made in a hurry, often guided by private interests and economic pressures. The result was a fragmented urban landscape, where skyscrapers sprang up among old houses without harmony, like scars from a botched surgery. The city lost part of its visual identity, and with it, part of its soul. The reaction was immediate. Citizens, architects, and historians joined together in protests. They denounced the disappearance of urban memory, the discarding of historical heritage, and the trivialization of architecture. The trauma of Brusselisation caused a new awareness to echo throughout Europe. Modernization, yes, but not at any cost. This urban crisis changed the course of planning in several capitals. From then on, strict preservation laws, height limits, and rules were introduced that required new buildings to be integrated into the historic fabric. In cities such as Paris, Rome, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, entire areas became untouchable. Nothing could be built above the old roofline. The landscape had to be preserved like a painting. Untouchable. Paris, for example, experienced its own dilemma. When the Montparnasse Tower was built in 1973, the tall, dark tower completely clashed with its surroundings. The rejection was so intense that new vertical constructions were banned in the city center. This was how La Défense was born, a skyscraper zone planned outside the historic area, where Paris could grow vertically without harming its classical aesthetics. This model was repeated in other capitals. Frankfurt, for example, created its modern skyline in strategic areas. London isolated its financial centers and imposed strict boundaries around monuments, such as St. Paul's Cathedral. Europe understood that it needed to evolve, but also to protect what made it unique. Brussels, with its painful experience, became a symbol and a lesson. It showed that progress, when blind to the past, can become destruction. From then on, verticalization in Europe became controlled, carefully planned, and thought of not only as a technical phenomenon, but as a cultural decision. In the 21st century, cities changed. The world urbanized rapidly. The pressure for housing, work, mobility, and sustainability transformed urban space into a silent battlefield. And once again, Europe found itself faced with a dilemma: stay true to its history, or give in to the demands of a future that demands height, density, and efficiency. In the last 2 decades, skyscrapers have once again appeared on the European map, but now, with caution, with limits, with planning. London, for example, has undergone a remarkable transformation. The financial district of Canary Wharf has been filled with towers. The city has begun to showcase bold buildings, such as the Shard and the Gherkin, but always respecting the protected views of historic landmarks, such as St. Paul's Cathedral. The growth was not a rupture, but a negotiation with the past. Paris has also adapted its model. The La Défense area is the focus of verticalization, while the historic center remains untouched. Moscow, for its part, has erected ambitious towers as part of a post-Soviet renaissance. Frankfurt has consolidated its role as a financial capital with a dense, modern skyline. Istanbul, with its contrasts between East and West, balances thousand-year-old mosques with glass towers on the banks of the Bosphorus. These cities represent a Europe that has learned to grow without fading. But not all have managed to achieve this balance. In many regions, resistance to verticalization remains strong. Heritage protection imposes strict limits. And while this preserves identity, it also generates exclusion. Prices are soaring, housing is scarce, and young people are pushed to the outskirts. In addition, environmental pressures bring new challenges. The horizontal model is less efficient in terms of energy, transportation, and land use. Verticalization, if well thought out, can be an ally of sustainability. Green buildings, with water reuse, solar energy, and collective spaces, emerge as promises of an architecture that respects both the planet and memory. But fear remains. The fear of repeating the mistakes of Brussels. The fear of destroying what took centuries to build. Europe knows that its greatest wealth lies not only in its GDP or its technological innovation, but in its visible heritage, in each square, cathedral, alley, and facade that tells a story. Therefore, the European future will be defined less by the height of buildings and more by the delicacy of choices. The real challenge is not to build towers, but to build a coexistence between eras. A city that embraces the new without betraying the old. Verticalization may be inevitable, but in Europe, it will never be just a question of engineering. It will always be a question of identity. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson that the continent has to offer the world. Progress does not have to mean forgetting. The future can and should walk hand in hand with memory. No rush, no pressure, and above all, with respect to what makes a city, more than a collection of buildings, a living history. This was the journey of European cities that chose to preserve their roots instead of reaching for the sky. A continent that, even faced with the pressures of time, decided that its soul was more valuable than any modern silhouette. And now, I ask you, do you think that progress should respect memory, or that we need to abandon the past to build the future? Leave your opinion in the comments. Let's talk about it. If this story made you think, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves architecture, history, and cities. Here, each story is an invitation to feel, think, and see the world with different eyes.